first proper episode of Beating a Dead Horse of 2018. As always, I'm your host, Sean McKinda.
And I'm your host, Jackson Keller.
And this week, we're talking about Guillermo Del Toro's magnificent Shape of Water. Jackson saw this a couple weeks before me, so he's had a little bit more time to marinate on it. What do you, a couple weeks out, what are your thoughts on it?
So, going into this movie, I expected literally nothing. I am not a Del Toro super fan, although this movie has maybe convinced me that I should be, because the only other Del Toro movie I had seen before this was actually Pacific Rim, a movie that I was not all that fond of. So, never really felt the need to go seek out his other stuff, even though, I've been constantly told about how good his work is. And so I went to randomly go see this movie while I was home over the holidays, and again, no expectations. Knew it was made by Del Toro, knew that it was getting good reviews, but other than that, didn't really know what to expect. And what I found was just a moody, delightful, weird little thing, with characters that are kind of broad. I wouldn't necessarily call them like archetypes, but a little bit broad, but have enough like details and texture like here and there to flesh them out, make them feel a little bit more like real people. Just great, excellent visuals with a great score to just keep you kind of in this dreamy little place that you're sort of willing to go wherever Del Toro thinks he's gonna take you. And just after seeing some not great movies before, after being feeling a little down on the whole like Hollywood system, after kind of the disappointment and emotional turmoil that was seeing The Last Jedi. Emotional turmoil makes it sound way overblown, but a movie like that does get you sort of cynical about movies and the whole like Hollywood system. So this is the perfect antidote, like a very personal, cute little mood piece, with a lot of quirky, interesting stuff going on, that I thoroughly enjoyed. And it's a shame that in my shitty small town, the theater was already not playing it, so I couldn't watch it again.
That is the running problem with this podcast, isn't it?
It's a running problem with my life.
I, on the other hand, basically saw this movie yesterday. I went into it with some friends of mine. I had heard nothing but wonderful, wonderful things about it. I was expecting something, to be perfectly honest, I was expecting a movie that was a little bit artsier, if that makes sense. Something like along the lines of like Three Billboards, where it's trying to make a grand statement and uses some interesting ideas and whatnot and concepts. And it wasn't that. And that's not a bad thing. This movie took me by surprise from what I was expecting of it and made itself comfortably a romance movie with some very interesting ideas behind it. And that's not, like, I liked it a lot. I thought it was a really solid movie. I think I have some problems with it that we'll kind of touch on later, but nothing that I would say like, it's good, there's problems with it, don't see it. No, it's good. I would recommend people go watch it, especially if you're a fan of like romance movies or even just Guillermo Del Toro in general. He does a wonderful, wonderful job with this movie. Incredible shots, incredible setup, incredible ideas, some very cool subtitling going on that I really, really like. It's a really solid movie, and I enjoyed it quite a bit.
See, I don't know if I would agree that it's like completely void of ideas. I do agree that there's not maybe not a grand unifying statement, but I think there's some subtle critiques, some subtle and not so subtle, definitely, like examinations of society. I think that personal vision is still really coming through, although I do agree that the movie is very loose. Watching it, that was the one Closest thing I had to like a major criticism of it was that normally I've got a big uh fascination. I don't know if fascination is the right word, but I place a lot of importance on structure in movies. I like when things are set up and paid off, and characters' actions like play one thing into another, and it all just sort of moves into it. When it's all this nicely like well constructed like piece. This movie didn't quite feel like that, although in this case, I am willing to look past certain things, go beyond my usual expectations if it serves the purpose of the movie, and in this case, I think that the sort of looser feel kind of helped keep this dreamy atmosphere, this sort of, not in, maybe what we're seeing isn't entirely reality. I don't want to say, like, magical realist, though maybe. I think the looseness and the fact that it wasn't 100% like a sturdy ship, haha, water, it didn't bother me as much as it maybe would have in another type of movie.
I'm going to really quick defend my statement of it felt like more of a straight romance movie. I'm not meaning to say that there weren't themes in it, and I realize that that's entirely how it came across. There were absolutely ideas, there were absolutely themes and concepts. I was just more so saying that I was expecting things that you might have to kind of parse out. These were much more on the surface level, things that are pretty easily accessible.
Yeah.
So that's more what I meant by less themes and ideas than what I was expecting there to be. Not that there aren't any, they're just not hidden within the subtext of the movie.
No, it's all very much text. This is a movie about the downtrodden, about outsiders, about weirdos, and it wants you to know it. It wants you to remember that at all times.
The whole military themes are very clear as well. There's a lot of, and I'm not spoiling anything by saying so. It's pretty clear from the trailers and whatnot. But it's very American government does what it needs to do type of thing, and take that how you will. It's honestly it's very reminiscent of like Iron Giant in that way. So take from it what
Iron
you
Giant
will.
is actually a pretty good comparison.
I was actually kind of thinking about that. It kind of is a good comparison. In Iron Giant, a boy falls in love with a giant robot, and this, a woman falls in love with a fish monster. It's the same thing. What are you gonna do? So yeah, it's clearly not the exact same, but the themes and kind of ideas behind it are very similar between the two of them.
50s, 60s, Cold War, paranoia, like spies and subterfuge and worrying about the Russians, and yeah, there's a lot of that.
God, I want to watch Iron Giant again now. Then with that, we're going to slide right into the spoilers and get into a little bit more of the theme and tone and how it kind of plays off each other and the time period. So the big thing that I really noticed as I was watching this movie, and Jackson kind of, when we were doing our pre-discussion, Jackson kind of clarified where I was having issues rectifying. Because this movie kind of plays as both a PG-13 kind of almost Disney fairy tale type romance, and then changes over to like a hard R-rated movie. There are lots of the bad swear words. There are nudity. There is just some really gruesome, not gore, but body horror that, like, I'm usually pretty good about body horror. I almost threw up in the theater with it. It was rough. But I was kind of having a hard time consolidating the two ideas, and I liked it, and I was kind of trying to figure out why so much of it felt like a PG movie when there was a lot of very adult elements to it. And I kind of came to the conclusion that it was because the basic plot is, she falls in love with a fish man, but there's an underlying B plot of the military evil man coming for them to bring him back. And early on in the movie, he loses his fingers, which they reattach, and then you spend the rest of the movie watching his fingers essentially decay as they're on him. And it's a really cool parallel with his mental state and the current way his world is going. Very on the nose, but still interesting to watch.
And also just fucking nasty when he like oozes pus onto people and rips his fingers off, and ooh.
It's rough. And so I was kind of consolidating with the fact that is like, it's very necessary to the movie. It feels like a very deliberate inclusion. It's cool. It's an interesting idea. It's the worst thing anyone has ever put to film. And I mean that in the best possible way. So my opinion of it was that they kind of took this theme that was clearly going to be pushing the movie into the R-rated territory, said, fuck it, we're just going to, swear all you want, show the nudity, show whatever, go for it, who cares? And I'm like, all right, I get that. And I thought it kind of played off each other well. It was a very kind of weird conglomerate of the two that worked in a good way. Jackson, however, pointed out why they probably actually did it.
Well, because it seemed a lot more deliberate to me, because I too felt sort of the tonal shifts, but I think it's important to remember that as far as like kind of the R-rated content, like the movie is very clear in that in the first 5 minutes we have a woman masturbating to an egg timer. This is a movie where, it's a romance with a fish man. They make it abundantly clear that she fucked the fish man. They make no bones about it. There's no ambiguity.
They discuss the penis. Like, they're like, so he has a penis? Yeah, how does it work?
They literally have have a little chat about it, about how it unsheaths itself from his interior, and it's amazing.
Oh, don't say that word.
But no, well, and here's one of the things I really appreciate about the movie is that her having sex with the fish man, her falling in love with the fish man, like some of the characters treat it as weird, some of her friends treat it as weird, but the movie never treats it as weird. The movie just accepts it as it is, and it accepts that this not just this sexuality, but all of the other elements that sort of come into play with the violence, they're all, I think, really essential parts of the film, because of the setting, both partially in the time period. I think the time period's a good encapsulation of these ideas. It's a good shorthand when you think of the 50s and the 60s and kind of the early pre-JFK assassination Cold War. That's sort of the image you get of those are the good old days that people will talk about as being when America was a simpler time, when everything was white picket fences, mom, pop, 2 kids and a dog.
When it was great.
Yes, this indeed. But when you look at the actual history of the 50s and the 60s, that's not actually how it was. They were a time of segregation, of brutalization of minorities, of women, again, deeply misogynist values. And of course, by setting in the time, Del Toro is kind of implicitly referring to all the stuff that's going on today, making that connection. But I think what the tone is doing then is by having this light, kind of kid-friendly, fairy tale, almost Disney-ified, mood in some places, and then having, on one end of the spectrum, Michael Shannon ripping off his fingers and, throwing them at somebody, and then on the other, again, all the, the mechanics of fishman sex, is that I think the film, with its tone, is making that part of the text, is that the veneer of the 50s is just that. It's an illusion. It's still, full, on one end of the spectrum, it's still full of, death and espionage and cruelty, as emphasized by Michael Shannon's character. But on the other hand, it's also, shown by all the other characters as that the adult element isn't necessarily, a bad thing or a degenerate thing. with the Giles, Eliza's gay artist friend. You kind of see his struggles in a lot of detail. Of course, Zelda, Octavia Spencer's character, kind of struggling in society as like a black woman. And of course, we have the mute main character Eliza and her love with the Fishman. And it sounds so glib when you say it like that. It sounds like, just by saying it sounds like you're making fun of it. Like, oh, it's a movie about a girl who falls in love with a Fishman. But the movie sees something like beautiful in that weirdness. And even though it's not the glossy veneer of like Michael Shannon going home to his 2.5 kids, which is made very explicitly clear. I actually really like that we get those scenes of him coming home to his house that looks like it walked right out of Giles' advertisements that he's drawing, and he's still, of course, a decaying, like, monstrous psychopath.
There's even allusion to that because the wife brings out green Jello, and what the Giles is trying to draw is a green Jello ad. Like, it is a clear analogy.
Yep. It's coming back to that consumerism. So even though like they're both like the adult content of the movie, it's still making like a clear distinction that yes, like the 50s, underneath the veneer, there's all the like bad like government espionage, torture, all the horrible stuff going on in the world, but also, people struggling, people who maybe don't fit into the mainstream, people who are just trying to get by and like find some sense of companionship in the world. And I think that's just great that the movie doesn't keep it to just that one binary of the veneer of the 50s and the actual 50s, because I feel like that tends to be how it goes, of like there's the capitalist projection of how life should be, and either that's the ideal that like we want, or that's the lie, and like everything is actually just really terrible, and the government's doing all this stuff, etc., etc. Shape of Water goes one further and acknowledges the veneer is still the veneer, but the good things in the movie aren't the veneer. Like the veneer is really fake, while all the like genuine connections are happening with the characters on the fringes, and they're being forced to work and kind of interact around this system. So yeah, none of that had much to do with death per se, except for the government torturing the Fishman. But I think like that whole like hard R takes a puff of my cigarette. That's just how life is, man.
See, I will actually argue that I think it has a lot to do with death, though, because it is like that hard R comes a lot too from people dying. There is a Russian spy who initially helps out the Eliza get the Fishman out of the government facility, and he ends up getting killed in a very awful way. Like, there's no doubt about it. He gets his tongue shut off in just a really gross scene and is dragged across through the hole in his mouth to a like salt pile, and it's very this is how it is. This was how it was at the time type of thing. And it was jarring. And I think that if it wasn't for certain deaths, we wouldn't have that cross comparison as well. I think that the deaths really help solidify what the movie was trying to be as both a Disney fairy tale and a this is how life is. It was not what we remember it to be. The nostalgia is not always accurate. People died, people got hurt, people were killed in awful, awful ways, and I think that works really well.
And it was the government doing it specifically. The American government is where all the brutality is coming from, and I think it's interesting, even with Michael Shannon's character. Michael Shannon is one of my favorite things about this movie. I just love how much of a complete crazy man he is. And seeing this movie just like, I have no basis for this. I know nothing about Michael Shannon, but like if he's not like crazy in real life, I would be shocked.
He played it very
well.
No,
a testament to his acting ability. Great role for him, and I like that even with him as the bad guy, as like the misogynist, brutal, like military, like cruel figurehead. He's still a part of this system too, and it doesn't always. The brutality comes back to bite him sometimes. I like specifically how we get that scene of him and the general where he gives this big speech about how he served his country so well and he's dedicated all this time and come up with so many successes. He's asking basically like cash in all the goodwill he's earned. And the general basically just tells him, nah, find me the fish man or I'm going to feed you to the wolves. And it's a really great scene of like how even within this system of power, like the people who are perpetuating it are still, they're not totally immune to like the effects of this brutality in the end. That someone's got to be accountable, and that puts him like just as much into this sort of danger. And weirdly, like he's the obvious villain of the film, so I don't want to like equate him with the actual sympathetic characters. But weirdly, like maybe the movie wants to like portray him as sort of the true outsider by being reduced to this absolute like rabid dog maniac at the end. Because by the end, like, the what society's conceptions of normal are, like at first at the start of the movie, it's, Michael Shannon is what people see as normal. He's got his white collar shirt. He's got his wife and kids. He gets his brand shiny new car and is really proud of it. Whereas all the other characters are societally like positioned as the weirdos. But then by the end of the movie, with the protagonist having this compassionate act of trying to release the fishman into the sea, and they're all presented as being like really rational about it, like really loyal friends. Like again, the movie doesn't think there's anything crazy about Eliza's little romance with the fishman. They end up together and it's a happy ending. She gets her gills and it's delightful. But by the end of it, like the actual weirdo, the actual crazy person is Michael Shannon, like shooting people with guns and dragging them around by their cheeks and just like snarling like a rabid dog. So we get kind of that nice flip, that nice flip at the end, and it gives Michael Shannon the opportunity to just go ham. It's great.
It is. He goes ham in just such a beautiful way and makes it insane. And like I actually would like to kind of focus on his finger thing for a couple seconds here, because as I alluded to, it is very representative of his mental state, and like kind of as they die, so too does he in a way. And I really thought that was a beautiful way of, it's very simple, but it's a beautiful way of making that analogy. And it's really hard for whatever reason. Like I couldn't tell you the technique that they used or anything like that, but they did a wonderful job of making sure that you watch his fingers, because early on, as I said, they get bit off by the fish monster, and there's no name for him. We're just going to continue to call him Fish Monster, the Asset, something like that. And they are reattached, and you just watch them decay throughout the movie. They change colors the entire time. You watch them go from like a skin color to a little bit more pallid. Then you start seeing them turn blue and black as things start to go wrong. And it's gruesome and great. The first sign, they get bit off, they're reattached. It seems like things are kind of on the upswing. And then as soon as he goes home and has sex with his wife, she points out that his fingers are bleeding as he's covering her mouth with his hand, which is kind of like the first sign of the cracks in the relationship and the cracks in his world. And as I said, like, this stuff is not deep by any means. Like, you don't have to have been watching movies and reading things about movies your whole life to see the parallels. But it's so beautifully focused on that it's hard to ignore them. Like, more than anything, I'm just impressed by how you get people to just pay attention to this guy's hand the entire movie when there's so much else happening. There's conversations that you should be listening to, other things that you need to be paying attention to, but instead you're watching this man's hand die, and it's great. I love it. And it pays off when he rips his fingers off of his sutured fingers off of his hand, crushes them and throws them across the room, and it's hideous, and I love it so much. And like, this is where he goes full tear and he starts just chewing the scenery and doing everything in his power to stop them before ultimately dying, as his fingers did. La, da, da, da. I just wanted to talk about that for a minute more than anything. I really liked it. I thought it was brilliant. Jackson and I both, before we even discussed doing the podcast, focused on those fingers so much because you can't not. And I don't know how they conveyed that you should. Like, I feel like they were always probably in one of the thirds on the sides, so not necessarily an immediate focal point, but they're usually on like a lower left third. So one of the points of the focus, but not necessarily the main point of focus for the scene.
They're just such an excellent bit of visual storytelling, which is something that Del Toro really excels at. I mean in this movie for sure. Just not just the fact that like the movie is aesthetically very beautiful, although it is. There's a lot of great shots, a lot of imaginative moments. But like all the small, there's just a lot of small details in this movie. Like the fact that it opens with the main character not just masturbating but underwater and to like an egg timer. It's just such an interesting choice, communicated entirely through visuals, that immediately sets the tone, communicates a lot about this character's desires. Like, it plants the idea of this, this obsession with the water, like, right away. Again, not something you need a film school degree to notice, but just a really unconventional way to show that. Like, you could have her, like a lesser filmmaker might have her, like, stare longingly at the lake or, like, dance around in the rain or something to communicate this, like, this love, this obsession, this something with water. But Del Toro goes with a much more memorable, much more, like, striking image that's, like, really indicative of the film that's about to play out before us. And the fingers are just the most consistent, I think, through line. And I guess also, like, with as a contrast, as Michael Shannon's fingers get more and more disgusting, and Michael Shannon gets more monstrous, the monster, the Fishman, is framed in more and more beautiful terms, less as a frightened, confused, like, creature in pain. The more that the characters kind of get to know him, to understand him, and try to communicate with him, the more, like, gentle and light he seems. Like, when they're just, like, the first time they have sex and they fill the room with the water, and like, they're just kind of, like, floating around. When he starts to, like, heal and glow, there's just a real there's a real sort of visual development with the monster that goes along with the story, and it's a nice contrast to the fingers. Oh, the fingers.
So on the subject of bringing the fishman home and his continuous rise into glorifying light within the film, there is one moment that kind of brings him down a couple pegs and reminds you that he is not all acquainted with humanity and human life. Specifically, there's a scene with a cat.
Poor kitty.
Yeah. If you're familiar with Elf, you probably know what's going to happen. Basically, if you're familiar with anything, you know what's going to happen because he sees the cat and you go, oh no, he's going to eat the cat. And he does. He eats the cat.
Oh, and you see its like body and meat, and like he's eating its head off, and poor kitty.
It's a very poor kitty, and I feel bad for him. But they also took this moment to be very clever. And it's another one of those things where it's not like subtle shots or anything like that. It's very outwardly clever, but if you're not listening, you might have missed it. Because after he eats this cat, Giles, the guy who owns the cat, comes in and says, no, don't eat that. He runs out of the house, and then he picks up the cat and says something along those lines of like, poor Pandora, which is very clearly an analogy to Pandora's box, and the opening of it strewed chaos into the world, which I thought was just kind of a cute little thing because the monster immediately runs out of the house, and this is after they've unleashed the monster from the lab and everything like that. Like it's clearly representative of opening Pandora's box and the chaos that causes it to enter their life and whatnot. It was just kind of a cute little thing that they did, and I appreciated it a lot. I liked it. That's all.
See, I admittedly did not notice, mostly because I was too focused on, oh, poor kitty, but also Giles' reaction. Very understated. Not that this is like necessarily a fault with the movie, but like the next time when Eliza comes home and he's explaining to her what happened, he's like, oh, he ate the cat, like I should have known better, like, you know, don't blame him, which, you know, is all sweet and empathetic for the fishman and all, but also, like, if the creature had eaten my dog, like, I would be very upset. Very upset.
Yeah, it was so weirdly nonchalant and just, cat's dead. It happens, you know. Sometimes you bring a horrifying monster into the house, and sometimes he eats the head off your cat. Sometimes he doesn't. You never know what's going to happen. It just kind of goes sometimes.
I mean,
such is life.
And it is a good detail for Giles, though, just to show that even though he is, he is ultimately, like, empathetic. Like, we get him I know early in the movie, I wasn't super keen on him. Seemed like kind of a blowhard. Like kind of, I wasn't quite sure about his relationship with Eliza. He seemed kind of like mansplaining. And just overall, not someone I super liked, but just more and more we kind of see like kind of how lonely his life is and how like his ambitions were sort of thrown off track. And by the time after he's sort of suffered this incident at a diner where he tries to make a connection with a guy and flirt with him and is, you know, thrown out for being gay, by the time that he decides to help her free the monster, you can really believe kind of this like loneliness and this empathy. So the fact that he continues to be empathetic towards the monster even after his cat has been eaten, you know, it's probably not how I would have reacted. But I also appreciate that the movie just didn't go for kind of the expected, like, cheap drama, like, I knew you never should have brought that thing into the house, like, kind of glad it didn't do that, just because it's played out and also not in the spirit of like understanding, even if poor Kitty.
Yeah, I didn't really look at it in that way. It does kind of work well as a subversion of expectations and more just kind of it increases your empathy towards this character that I didn't actually really have as much of an issue with in the beginning of the movie. I can kind of see where you're coming from because in hindsight, it makes sense. She comes over and brings him food, and he makes a crack about being a starving artist. And given that you already have the idea that this is set in the 1950s, given that there's like an egg timer and shit like that, you kind of wonder who's taking care of who. Is this some sort of weird relationship? And so immediately you kind of get on edge a little bit about this just from some of the visual cues and whatnot. I think unlike Jackson, my fears were assuaged pretty quickly when she brought him food and he goes, "Thank you. If it wasn't for you, I would literally be a starving artist." And I got kind of more of a, okay, they're friends. This isn't something weird going on here. This is a good vibe. All right. It doesn't feel odd to me. So my empathy for him only kind of grew throughout the movie, but I can see where Jackson would have been like, I don't know how I feel about this guy. Kind of got that 1950s misogyny vibe behind him a little bit.
Yeah, and I was a little bit worried about this movie in general, like at the beginning being like condescending towards Eliza, especially since she will ultimately be the one to do the deed with the fishman. So how the movie sees her is kind of important. It's very important, and I'm glad the movie never really condescends to her. She wants to save this fishman, and her friends, they don't get it. They really don't. At least not at first. But they're gonna help her out because they trust her, they believe in her. And like even like I know the dancing at the beginning, like the fixation on dancing. I was worried that was going to end up being like a subplot along the lines of like, oh, like you wanted to be like, you love performance, you wanted to be a performer, but you never can be because you can't talk, or something like that, or something like trite and played out like that. But it doesn't end up being that, and it just ends up being a delightful little character beat. And the whole movie is delightful little character beats.
As Jackson intoned earlier, there is nothing about this movie that ever really belittles any characters. Everyone, even for all their quirks, are treated with utmost respect and understanding for one another. And I really, really like that. You never get the idea that she is less than anyone else because she is mute or anything like that. There's never any sort of knocking of any of them, not even the fish monster. It's just a continuous celebration of them as characters, as them as the weirdos and outcasts, as we've said. They don't fit in as they might today or might not today. They are just people, and they are treated as just people within this movie, and that's wonderful. There's never anything that they can't do because of their race, sex, gender, sexual identity, or species. It's always very open and accepting, and it's great. Honestly, it's wonderful for that. So we're going to kind of get into our closing segment, which, as always, is kind of a grand idea that we might or might not have about the movie. And this is one that I am kind of on the fence about. It was one that I've been kind of hemming and hawing about since I saw it, and I don't know how accurate it is. I would very much, if you're listening to this episode and you've seen Shape of Water, please let me know what your thoughts on it are. Especially because in light of our research into Guillermo Del Toro.
let's not make it sound like more than it was. Our quick Google and Wikipedia scan of Guillermo Del Toro.
Fair. So the one thing that kind of continued to run throughout this movie that I continued to pick up on was the idea of gods and deities. It's opened up with one of the cats being named Thor. Another one is Pandora, which, yes, I know isn't a god, but is very closely associated with the Greco-Roman mythologies. And there's other cats that you can only assume are along the same lines. There are religious themes from some of the characters. There's a constant reference to the fishman as being worshipped as a god amongst the people where he was taken from. Questions about whether he is a god, etc., etc. So I kind of had this theming of gods in my mind as I was watching this movie. Like, I was just very, for whatever reason, in tune to the constant reference to it. So at the end of it, I was kind of thinking about why they might have continued to present gods in such a way. And I came to the realization that it could be an odd retelling of the Jesus story, essentially. And before I dive into it, the first nail in this coffin is that Guillermo del Toro, despite being raised Roman Catholic, I believe, is not very religious anymore. So, yeah, that might not be great for the theory.
Death of the author. Keep going forward.
That said, Michael Shannon's character spends the entire movie, or a portion of the movie, speaking to Zelda, one of the cleaning ladies, and referring to her by her middle name, which is Delilah. And that pays off in him seeing himself as Samson from Samson and Delilah, the Old Testament story. And he spends a large portion of like the final act of the movie being a self-proclaimed Samson, running around bringing the house of everything down upon himself in order to smite his enemies. My argument is that he is not going to end up being Samson, because in the final couple scenes of the movie, he does shoot the fishman, and the fishman dies. And he is, proud of his successes and whatnot. Before the fishman gets up, wipes the bullet holes away, and is once again reborn, or if you will, he is risen. So I see this whole final act more of a retelling of Jesus' death, because it makes sense that if you want Michael Shannon to be a religious figure, he sees himself as one, but actually more or less plays the role of Pontius Pilate. He is a man whose whole world is being threatened. His kingdom is being usurped by the Son of God, or in this case, the fishman, as he has escaped and now has to deal with the consequences, which would be the loss of his kingdom. Similarly, Pontius Pilate wanted Jesus dead for very similar reasons. So he then proceeds to kill their Jesus, their fishman, and, it rises and redeems his followers. There's even a Judas character within this movie. There is Zelda's husband betrays the fisherman and betrays Eliza to Pontius Pilate, who then goes and kills them. I do see that some of this could be seen as a stretch, and I realize that it's not all necessarily there. Like, all the pieces aren't necessarily there, but I think enough of them are to make it a somewhat valid theory. And as I said, I would love, if you've seen this movie and you have a thought on it, let me know, because I am curious as to where's the big hole that I'm missing, because I feel like there's something in this that will just tear the whole thing down. And it could be that Guillermo Del Toro isn't religious anymore, because that's a big hole.
Well, you are right in that the movie does have this motif, this preoccupation with gods, and it, explicitly refers to the Old Testament like that. One thing that, having the movie not right in front of me that I just thought about, one thing that would be helpful in terms of reading the fishman as like a Christ figure is where the scenes, if there's a scene of Eliza like cradling his body, like a Pieta imagery. I don't remember how the scene of him getting shot goes down. I don't know if there is a scene of her cradling his limp and lifeless body. But that's very famous Christ imagery, like Pieta, religious, the Mary presenting Jesus. That would go along with the potential Jesus allegory. Now, I didn't quite see it that way. As far as the preoccupation with gods, mostly for the biblical references, I saw that again just as more of a sign that Michael Shannon was kind of our figure of the establishment. There's nothing more establishment and cruel than the Old Testament. So the fact that he is trying to embody this vengeful Old Testament figure, goes along very well with the sort of anti-establishment feel of this movie.
See, I would argue that there's nothing as anti-establishment and peaceful as a lot of the New Testament. I mean, as the saying goes, Jesus was a socialist and whatnot. So I think it kind of works in a way.
Yeah, it doesn't contradict your reading at all, certainly. But where I found the other elements, like the references to the Norse gods and the preoccupation with the Fishman being a god, is that it seemed to me just to more harken back to mythological imagery, kind of plant that in your mind just to go along with the general feel. Like fairy tales and myths aren't necessarily the same thing, but you can see this as kind of a myth playing out in a somewhat modern setting. You have the trapped beast of great power who is being held against his will by men, and then the one woman in her compassion decides to free him, and she is rewarded in the end with her gills and transcends the other all the other small-minded people around her. And you can see that as a kind of fable, so I can see kind of this inclusion of this god idea as maybe trying to emphasize that. But this is not to poo-poo on your reading at all. I just didn't quite see it in those terms because Lord knows I have an English degree. My entire life, in fact, is to make stretches and try to see things where perhaps nothing is. So I gotta give it to you here. And nothing, and as you say, nothing that I can recall off the top of my head really contradicts this, except for possibly the fact that Del Toro identifies as an atheist now. But even when you are raised religious, it doesn't really totally leave you. So the fact that even subconsciously he could have been drawing on those kind of ideas is certainly still a possibility.
And even arguing with the idea that it is just trying to create a myth out of what is going on, that kind of plays into Del Toro's views nowadays, as I'm thinking about it. Because as an atheist, or as an identified atheist, he would view Christianity and those as myths. They are the same as the Greco-Roman myths or the Norse myths or whatnot. It's just another way of telling a story. And Christ imagery is not a foreign thing to movies. People use it with
all the time.
Yeah, it's a constant at this point. So wouldn't be surprised if it was more accidental, or maybe not necessarily an intentional retelling, or just a continuous idea of this is a myth. It's something that could be real, it could not be real. Who knows? Take it as you want it. So, I don't know. I think that there's an idea there, and I would argue that some of it has to be intentional, but it could also be an entire thing that I just picked up on and supplanted my own ideas and understandings into. So, take from it what you will. Tell me why I'm wrong. Then with that, we're going to bring this episode to a close. If you do want to tell me why I'm wrong, please tweet at me at Sean_McKinda. Or if you want to come yell at me in person, you can join me in my Twitch chat every Wednesday, Thursday, and Sunday at twitch.tv/helpless_Skippy.
And if you want to tell me why I'm right and pay homage, you can find me over on Twitter at Jackson J. Keller. At me, but only if I'm right.
Or if you'd like to incite a riot between the two of us, please tweet at the podcast itself at BADH_cast. We both look at that, so if you leave it vague, we'll probably just fight with each other about who you're talking about. So that might be a fun idea.
Sow the seeds of division.
End the podcast.
Have you ever heard the tragedy of beating a dead horse? It's not a story the Jedi would tell you. Okay.
Jesus Christ. As always, we'd like to thank Lords of the Highway for the use of our theme song. It is Suicide Alternate Take off the album High Octane Low Expectations. It's on Spotify. It's, wherever you want to get your music. Go check it out. They're a great band, bunch of cool people, well worth listening to. Next week, I will be on vacation, and unfortunately, we did not find time to record a backup episode, so go back and listen to some of our old stuff and, review some old movies. We will talk to you in 2 weeks.
Don't you go into the ground. Don't you go